Congressman Ethan Cole had one piece of paper on his knee, folded twice, and he never once looked down at it. What happened in the next 40 minutes wasn't a debate. It was the moment a career built on repetition finally met a room that stopped repeating it back. Don't go anywhere, because the next few minutes are the kind of television that gets replayed for years. Senator Adrian Kessler checked his watch. Then he checked it again 40 seconds later. By the third glance, the people in the first few rows had started watching the watch instead of watching him. The way a room full of people can't help but stare at a countdown clock, even when nobody announces what it's counting down to. 4 feet away, Ethan Cole sat with his hands folded in his lap, wearing the kind of stillness that only comes from a man who learned a long time ago that the person talking the loudest in a room is rarely the person who leaves it standing. The paper stayed face down on his leg. He didn't touch it. He let the silence stretch out a beat longer than was comfortable, then a beat longer than that, before he finally leaned toward the microphone and spoke in a voice so level it almost sounded bored. "You spent 2 years telling this country you'd personally seen something," he said. "Tonight I'm only going to ask you to show me one piece of it." And Adrian Kessler, a man who had never in 20 years of public life been caught without a comeback, had nothing. To understand how a politician whose entire identity was built on the phrase, "I've seen the proof," ended up frozen in front of a live audience, you have to go back to the beginning of the night, back to the moment he still believed he was the smartest person in the building. The event was called the National Trust Forum, held in a converted convention hall. The local press had nicknamed Grayson Auditorium for its long, curved rows and a stage lit like a boxing ring. Every major outlet had a camera crew stationed along the back wall, and word had gotten around days earlier that the organizers had deliberately seated these two particular men on the same panel, hoping for exactly the kind of collision that makes for good ratings. The hall was over capacity an hour before doors opened. Ushers were turning people away at the side entrances. In the front row sat a heavy-set man in his early 60s named Grady Simmons, glasses pushed up on his forehead, a farm jacket draped over the back of his chair, even though it was summer. Grady had driven 4 hours from a small town outside Harrisburg. His son had spent a year and a half of his life, and most of the family's savings fighting off an accusation that never had anything solid behind it, an accusation that got repeated on TV long after it should have quietly disappeared. Grady wasn't there for a partisan brawl. He was there because, just once, he wanted to watch somebody ask the obvious question out loud, in public, where it couldn't be dodged. He sat with his hands folded on his knee, waiting. The moderator, a calm woman with a clipped professional cadence, opened with a few pleasant remarks about restoring public confidence in institutions. When she turned to Kessler for his opening thoughts, he took the microphone like a man reaching for something that already belonged to him. "I'll be blunt, since apparently that's what tonight is about," he said, a tight smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I look at the man sitting next to me, and I see someone who fundamentally does not understand how truth actually functions in this country. A veteran who did a short stint in public affairs, came home, wrote a best-selling memoir about hardship, mailed a copy of it to an Ivy League admissions office, and somehow that qualifies him to lecture the rest of us on facts, on justice, on how our institutions are supposed to work." A low ripple moved through the crowd, not quite a gasp, but close enough to feel, and his supporters deserve the truth too, Kessler continued. The people who only read headlines, who only believe what already confirms what they think, they've been convinced that people like me, careful people, are the liars. Meanwhile, a man who has never once had to meet an actual evidentiary standard gets treated like the honest one in the room. My whole career has been built on one rule. I only say what I've personally confirmed. He wouldn't even know where to begin. He leaned back, glanced at his wrist again, looking pleased with himself, completely unaware he'd just handed his opponent the exact opening he needed. Ethan Cole didn't flinch. He'd taken worse hits from tougher rooms. He let the applause Kessler was expecting die out on its own, thin and scattered, fading into nothing before he even reached for his mic. When he did speak, the first thing out of his mouth was a thank you. "I appreciate that, Senator. I mean that," he said. "That might be the most useful thing anybody says here tonight." He let the word useful sit there for a second. "You just gave me 2 things to work with, and I intend to use both of them. You said you're careful. You said you only speak on things you've personally confirmed. That's a good standard. Let's put it right here on the table where everybody can see it." "I'd be happy to walk you through it," Kessler said, slower now, more careful. "I'd like that. I'm a simple guy. Let's start simple." There were no props, no binder, no folder full of printouts, no dramatic flourish, just that one folded piece of paper on his knee, still untouched. Anybody who had watched Cole in a hearing room before recognized the pattern immediately. He never opened with the strike. He always checked the footing first. You said you only go on air with things you've personally verified, Cole repeated. I want to make sure I've got that right because everything after this depends on it. You're the careful one. You're the guy who waits for hard evidence. I'm not putting words in your mouth. That's the exact foundation you built your whole career on. He nodded slightly, the way a neighbor nods approvingly at somebody's lawn, right before mentioning the fence is 2 feet over the property line. So we agree. You don't go on television and say things unless you've seen proof. You've never gotten ahead of the facts. Hold on to that, Senator. Really hold on to it. I choose my words with precision, Kessler said, unable to resist the bait. That's the exact thing that separates me from people like you. Perfect. That's all I needed. Because let's go back to the spring of a few years ago, Cole said. You went on national television and told the country, your words, that you had more than circumstantial evidence of a coordinated scheme with a foreign power, not a suspicion, not something worth looking into, more than circumstantial. You said you'd seen it. He tilted his head, almost gently, and then you kept saying it, over and over, on every outlet that would put a microphone in front of you. People who tracked it counted more than 200 separate instances over roughly 2 years. 200 times, Senator, you told the American public you had personally seen the proof. The room went dead quiet, and when the investigation the whole country had been waiting for finally landed, Cole continued, it confirmed some things. It confirmed contact happened. It confirmed certain communications took place. But on the central claim, the actual coordinated scheme, the thing you swore under your own name you had seen, it came up empty. The very people who spent 2 years combing through everything couldn't find the thing the careful television commentator had already confirmed 200 times. He paused, letting it land. So I'm not calling you a liar, Senator. I wouldn't do that. I'm asking a basic question. You said you saw it. Show me one piece of it, not 200 pieces. 1. The first laugh came quiet, then died fast. But it was there because everybody in that room had lived through those 2 years and didn't need the context spelled out for them. And the part that made it sting so much wasn't complexity. It was how simple the ask actually was. Kessler wasn't being cornered with legal jargon or a tangle of dates. He was being handed the simplest possible request by the exact man he'd just called too uneducated to understand the law. If you've ever watched somebody talk down to you and later found out they had nothing behind it, drop a comment right now, because this is only the first crack. Stick around. Kessler's jaw tightened. He'd survived tougher rooms than this one, and his instinct kicked in on autopilot when the ground shifts changed the subject to something bigger than the question. He pulled the mic closer. His tone snapped back into the register he was known for, the prosecutorial cadence that had carried him through 100 interviews. Let me tell you what's actually happening here, he said, looking past Cole, straight into the cameras, because he understood the clip mattered more than the room. This is a textbook political hit job. A man who stood up to the most dangerous administration this country has seen in decades, while his colleagues sat on their hands, is now being put on trial by that same administration's hand-picked messenger. And the supposed crime, being right too early and too loudly. I did my job. I followed the facts as I understood them. The interference was real. The contacts were real. And people like him would rather go after the person who raised the alarm than deal with what actually happened. I make no apologies for defending this country, not to him. Not to anyone. And credit where it's due, it was a good move. It had worked in 100 studios before this one, and for about 20 seconds it worked again. The room tilted slightly back toward him. A reporter's pen moved fast across a notepad. A young staffer in the third row who'd been smirking at Cole's earlier point suddenly looked back down at her notes. The momentum held for a while, because there's a reflex in rooms like this to respect big, confident language over the quieter flaw sitting underneath it. It might have held for longer, but it wasn't Cole who broke it. At the far end of the stage, a third panelist finally leaned into his microphone. He was older, maybe 70, with a slow, tired voice and hands that looked like they'd spent decades signing documents nobody remembers reading. He was a registered Democrat, had been his whole life, 30 years as a federal prosecutor before retiring, and up until this exact moment, he hadn't said a word all night. I'll say one thing, and then I'll go back to being quiet, he rasped. I'm a Democrat. I've got no love for the man you keep bringing up, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I spent 30 years in rooms where you are not allowed to say you have evidence unless you're prepared to hand it to 12 people who've never met you. That's not a partisan rule. That's the entire profession. He turned and looked directly at Kessler. A lot of people trusted your word for 2 years, assuming a man with your access wouldn't say, I've seen it, unless it was true. And when the report came out, the central claim wasn't there. Being wrong is survivable. I've been wrong. What's not survivable is being wrong and then telling the public it's their fault for believing you in the first place. Whatever grip Kessler's earlier speech had on the room evaporated in that instant, replaced by something worse for him: permission to doubt. The young staffer in row 3 picked her pen back up and this time didn't look away. You could almost feel the room realize, all at once, that the armor he'd been wearing for years had never actually been armor. And it wasn't a political opponent who took it off him. It was a lifelong member of his own side. If this is the moment you started leaning forward in your seat, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because it only gets heavier from here. Cole let the quiet sit. He was good at silence, better than most people are good at talking. He picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with a small, deliberate click that was, for 3 full seconds, the only sound in the entire hall. I would have let the first mistake go, he said. I want that on record. A guy gets ahead of the story under pressure. That happens. I've done it myself. I once told donors I'd read a bill that was still being written. A ripple of real laughter moved through part of the crowd. So this isn't about tearing somebody down over one bad Sunday morning appearance. It genuinely isn't. But Senator, this wasn't one appearance. This was 2 straight years. And there's a second piece to this that I need people watching at home to really sit with. He turned the folded paper over on his knee. He still didn't lift it. He just looked at it. During one of those sessions, you read material directly into the official congressional record, he said. The permanent record. Material that came from a source file that even the people who compiled it eventually had to walk back. The main source behind that file was later charged with lying to federal investigators. The agency that had been working with him had already cut ties over reliability concerns before you ever stood up and read it out loud. He looked up. You're the careful one. You only talk about verified facts. And yet you put unverified material into a permanent government record forever because it fit the story you'd already been selling to the public. And here's the part that matters most. Cole went on, unhurried. When the source was charged, when the file fell apart, reporters asked you a simple question. Did you regret reading it into the record? And you said no. You said your wording was accurate. You said you'd do it again. He let that settle into the room. A careful, cautious public servant had every opportunity to say, I trusted bad information, and I was wrong to repeat it. Instead, he looked into a camera and said he'd change nothing. That's not caution, Senator. I don't know what the word for that is. But it isn't caution. Nobody laughed this time. It landed somewhere past humor, in the part of a room where people quietly finish making up their minds. If that part got to you, type the word proof in the comments right now, because Kessler's about to throw his last punch of the night, and it's the most desperate one yet. Kessler grabbed his mic again, the edge back in his voice, though now there was a strain underneath it that hadn't been there half an hour earlier. You're describing congressional oversight like it's a crime, he said. Asking hard questions isn't a crime. Taking allegations seriously isn't a crime. The world you seem to want is one where powerful people are never checked, where the watchdogs get punished and the guilty walk free. I did my constitutional job. If that's unpopular right now, I'll wear it. History remembers the people who acted, not the ones who stayed comfortable. I'll give you that much, and I mean it, Cole said. Oversight matters. A healthy country needs people willing to ask hard questions of powerful people. So let me give you the same fairness I'd want for myself. The investigation wraps up. It doesn't back the central claim. A careful public official, exactly the role you say you play, hits a fork in the road right there. He can stand up and say, I trusted bad intel, I repeated it, the findings didn't support it, and I owe the public an honest update. He paused. That's the dignified way out. Every public figure gets that option once. And I went back and looked closely at what you actually did in that window, because I wanted to be fair to you. He glanced down at the still folded paper. You didn't take it, he said flatly. You went right back on the air and told the public the evidence was still out there, plain as day, right after the investigators had already said they couldn't find it. And when people inside your own party started saying you'd overreached, you didn't walk it back. You said the real problem was that the public had gotten too used to politicians hiding things. He held his gaze steady. You had the one dignified exit every public servant is given, and you used it to blame the people listening to you. You told them, without saying it outright, that they just weren't smart enough to see proof that, to this day, you still haven't shown anybody. The sound that rolled through the crowd wasn't laughter this time. It was lower, heavier, the unmistakable sound of an audience quietly deciding they were done extending the benefit of the doubt. Kessler's fingers drifted toward his wristband, hesitated, and pulled back. That's an unfair twisting of a carefully considered position, he said. The rhythm of a courtroom cross-examination was still there in his voice, but the confidence underneath it had drained out completely. I never claimed absolute certainty I didn't have. I said the situation was serious. It was serious. Seriousness isn't recklessness. And some of us actually think before we speak instead of throwing the country into chaos. Some of us do, Cole answered quietly. That's really the whole question tonight, isn't it? Whether you're one of them? We're past the loyalty argument now, Senator. His tone wasn't cruel, but the warmth that had been in it earlier disappeared, replaced by something flat and even. Loyalty was the argument before your own colleagues formally rebuked you a couple years back. A close vote 211 to 207 that. Kind of formal rebuke happens once in a generation in that chamber. And the language they used, officially on the record, was that you had knowingly misled the public. He let it sit. That's not coming from me. That's not a partisan talking point. That's the judgment of the very institution you claim to be protecting. They reviewed your conduct and put your name in the permanent record right next to the word misled. You want to talk about permanent records? Your name's in there twice. Once for the material you submitted. Once for their decision about what you did with it. A low murmur moved through the hall, far heavier than mockery, the sound of a room collectively arriving at the same conclusion about a person's character. And here's what regular working people understand better than anybody in this building, Cole continued, his voice never rising. Because earlier tonight, you told the crowd they were too simple to tell the difference between emotion and fact. So let's look at a simple fact. There have been recent questions raised about whether the careful, fact-first public servant, the man lecturing everyone tonight about integrity, gave two different government agencies two different answers about where he actually lives. A place upstate and a place out west, both claimed at different points as his primary residence, depending on which answer benefited him more. A better mortgage rate on one, a tax break on the other. Same person, same signature. Two homes, both somehow his one and only primary residence, at the same time. The room went completely still. You've used every platform available to you to tell working people, the ones who fix your car, who pour your foundation, that they're too naive to understand the truth, Cole said, his voice sharpening for the first time all night, while they're signing one honest mortgage for the one house they actually live in. You lecture the country about facts, Senator, and people are starting to wonder if you've ever actually followed the standard you hold everybody else to. He'd spent the night telling working-class voters they weren't smart enough to see the truth, while facing his own questions about a residency claim that didn't add up. If your jaw is on the floor right now, hit that like button, because this isn't one slip. This is a pattern, and tonight it finally caught up with him in public. A staffer hurried up the side stairs and leaned in to whisper something in Kessler's ear, sliding a folded note onto the table in front of him. Kessler didn't touch it. He kept his eyes locked on Cole. But the front rows caught the staffer's expression on the way back down, the look of somebody delivering bad news that couldn't wait for the cameras to stop rolling. The note sat there, untouched, for the rest of the night. To his credit, Kessler didn't fold quietly. He straightened up, pulled the mic in close, and made one final stand. And it was, for a moment, genuinely powerful. You want to talk about courage? Let's talk about courage, he said, his voice dropping into something faster, rawer, more personal than anything he'd said all night. When that administration tried to bend every federal institution to its will, I didn't blink. When my own colleagues were too scared to say his name out loud, I stood on that House floor and said it to his face. They censured me for it. And you know what I told them? I told them their anger was a badge of honor. I meant every word. I'd do the whole thing over again tomorrow. You're sitting in a seat that man handed you, and you're calling my actions ignorant. I call it the one moment in my career I knew, without any doubt, that I was doing the right thing. I didn't get to worry about my own comfort. I gave all of it up to fight a fight you never had the spine to walk toward, and it worked. For a few seconds, it was genuinely moving. Part of the room leaned back toward him. A couple of reporters stopped writing. In that moment, he'd reached for the one true thing. He still believed about his own record, and it carried real weight. Cole let him finish. He gave the speech its full moment. Then, gently, he set all of it aside. Nobody on this stage is taking your courage away from you, Senator, he said, quiet enough that the whole room had to lean in to hear it. You stood your ground during a hard stretch. I'll say that anywhere, in any room in this country. But your courage was never on trial tonight. He finally picked up the folded paper, opened it, and laid it flat on the table in front of him, angled toward the cameras. Printed on it was Kessler's own most famous quote, sitting directly beside a single line pulled from the investigation's final conclusion. Here's what tonight was actually about, Cole said. You told this country more than 200 times that you had seen proof. The investigators who spent 2 years looking couldn't find it. You put unverified material into the permanent record anyway. Your own colleagues attached your name to the word misled. And when it all came apart, you told the public the real problem was that they'd been foolish enough to trust you in the first place. He let it sit one more time. You asked what the real difference is between us, since you brought up my background earlier. I was a combat correspondent. I reported what I saw. That job has exactly one rule that actually matters. You never publish a sentence you didn't witness yourself because people back home read it and believe it. If you print something you only hope is true, somebody makes a decision based on it. And you carry that for the rest of your life. He looked at Kessler without any anger in his face, which somehow made it land harder. I learned how truth works the hard way. You confirm it before you say it out loud. You called me the one who doesn't understand truth. Senator, that's exactly how it works. It's never worked any other way. The final line came slow. You called me ignorant, Cole said. I just never sold a story I couldn't back up. That's the only real ignorance in this room tonight. And it isn't mine. He never called him a liar. He never used the word fraud. That restraint was the thing people talked about for days afterward, because it made the moment land harder than any insult could have. He simply set the man's own repeated words next to the one line that undid them, and let the two sit there, side by side, impossible to separate. Kessler looked down at his wrist again, the same nervous habit he'd repeated all night, the tell of a man used to running out the clock until the segment ends, and the last word saves him. For the first time on live television, the last word never came. The quiet laughter scattered through the crowd, started climbing toward the stage, low but unmistakable. His hand drifted to his watch. He unclasped it, set it on the table beside the open paper, like his hands needed somewhere to go, but it didn't help. He leaned toward the mic, searching for the start of a sentence. All that came through the speakers was a sharp, ugly screech of feedback, cutting through a room that had gone completely silent, like something heavy hitting the floor of an empty church. He said nothing else. After a long, uncomfortable pause, the moderator quietly asked if he wanted to respond. He shook his head. That sound, the feedback ringing out over total silence, is what people remembered. That's what a reputation sounds like when it comes apart on live television. If that gave you chills, turn your notifications on, because what happened after the cameras stopped is almost as wild as what happened on stage. Keep watching. The hall emptied, but the story didn't stop there. Before most people had even reached the parking lot, the clip was already spreading, the 200 claims, the demand for one piece of proof, the rebuke from his own side, the watch coming off. Somebody had cut it together fast and clean. By midnight, it was nearly impossible to scroll anywhere online without running into it. And here's what should have worried Kessler more than anything else. Nobody was arguing about foreign policy anymore. Nobody cared about the finer points of the investigation, or oversight, or the big themes he'd walked in planning to dominate. That conversation was already over. People were just watching on a loop a man who'd said I've seen it 200 times fail to produce a single piece of it. The anger had burned off. What was left was exhaustion, and people were done. Outside in the hallway, a reporter caught up with a member of Kessler's own party who'd publicly backed him for years. He asked for anonymity, glancing down the hallway before he spoke. We all knew, he said. We knew a long time ago. We told ourselves it was just overconfidence, that maybe he had intel the rest of us didn't. It was never confidence. You can survive being wrong. You can't survive being asked for one piece of proof and reaching for your watch instead. The official was already gone before the recorder was fully back in the reporter's pocket. Grady Simmons drove the long stretch back toward Harrisburg that night without turning the radio on. He just watched the road, headlights cutting through the dark mile after mile. Somewhere past the state line, alone in the car with nobody to see him, he started laughing, really laughing at the image of a grown politician taking off his watch on live television. Because for 18 months, and most of his family's savings, his own son had lived the consequences of an accusation nobody was ever made to prove. And tonight, on a stage in front of the whole country, somebody had finally made a man like that answer for it. Ethan Cole didn't linger for the attention. He folded the paper back up, tucked it into his jacket, shook a couple of hands, and walked out past the reporters calling his name without stopping. He walked right past the empty seat and the watch still sitting on the table where the careful senator had run out of things to say. He came in with one folded piece of paper. He left with it still in his pocket. If this one hit you the way it hit us, smash that like button. It helps this reach the people who are tired of watching public figures dodge the one question that actually matters. And if you believe a person who only says what they can actually back up deserves more trust than someone who just talks louder, hit subscribe and drop the word proof in the comments below. Share this with somebody who needs to see it, because being polished was never the same thing as being honest, and being loud was never the same thing as being right. In the end, the whole country wanted the exact same thing that one quiet veteran asked for on that stage, a single piece of proof. And for one night, in front of everyone, the country got to watch exactly what happens to a man who never actually had it. By sunrise, the clip had a name of its own. Clips online rarely need one, but this one got tagged the same way within hours across a dozen different accounts, all landing on some version of the watch moment. News desks that had booked Kessler for their morning programs quietly rearranged their lineups. Two networks that had scheduled him for follow-up interviews the next day found reasons to push the segments back a week, then 2 weeks, then not at all. A producer who had worked with Kessler for nearly a decade told a colleague, off the record, that the calls started coming in before the segment had even finished airing. Bookers from 3 different shows, all asking some version of the same question. Had anyone confirmed the residency story, and did the network want to be the first to press him on it, or the last? Grady Simmons woke up the next morning to find his nephew had already sent him the clip twice, not realizing his uncle had been sitting 11 feet from the stage when it happened. Grady watched it a third time on his phone at the kitchen table, coffee going cold in front of him, and noticed something he'd missed the night before. In the wide shot, just after the feedback cut through the room, you could see his own hands still folded on his knee, exactly where they'd been for the entire panel. He hadn't moved once. The old prosecutor, Walter Pruitt, went back to his quiet retirement without giving a single follow-up interview. When a reporter tracked down his address and asked for a comment 2 days later, he said only that he'd meant what he said on that stage and didn't have anything to add to it. Then he closed the door. People who knew him said that was exactly the kind of answer they'd expect. 30 years of courtroom discipline doesn't just switch off because a clip goes viral. Inside Kessler's own office, staffers described the days that followed as the quietest the place had ever been. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was in crisis mode in the way people picture when they imagine a scandal. It was quieter than that. Phones that used to ring constantly with interview requests simply stopped ringing, and nobody wanted to be the one to point it out. Ethan Cole gave exactly one interview about the exchange, 3 days later, and in it he refused to gloat. When a host tried to get him to describe the moment in dramatic terms, he shrugged it off. "I didn't do anything except ask him to hold up to his own standard," he said. "That's not a takedown. That's just what's supposed to happen every single time, to everybody, regardless of party. It just doesn't happen very often anymore, so when it does, it looks like something bigger than it is." Reporters pressed him on whether he thought Kessler's career was finished. He wouldn't bite. "That's not for me to decide, and it's not for you to decide either," he said. "That's for the people who trusted him for 200 repetitions to decide, now that they've seen what happens when somebody finally asks him to back it up." Whether or not Kessler ever recovers his footing, the clip itself already did what clips like it tend to do. It outlived the news cycle that produced it. Months later, it was still being passed around, still being cited anytime a public figure got caught making a claim they couldn't support, a shorthand for a very specific, very familiar kind of moment. The instant a person built entirely on confidence runs headfirst into someone who only ever needed the truth. If you made it this far, you already know why this one keeps getting shared. It's not really about Kessler, and it was never really about Cole. It's about the split second where somebody gets asked to prove the thing they've been saying for years, and the whole room finds out all at once whether they actually can.